These are the Black Hills of South Dakota, once the hunting grounds of the Lakota Sioux. It took a decade for the white settlement of the plains to encroach this far west. But the whites came, in search not this time of land, but of something even more precious: gold. One of those first Sioux into the hills, typically scornful of Lakota rights, was a certain Annie Tallent.
For centuries, those beautiful pine-clad hills had lain in an isolation almost as complete as that of darkest Africa. But from 1874, the Black Hills were a mystery no longer. The spirit of adventure was abroad in the land, and those gold-ribbed hills were snatched from the hands of savages and given over to the thrift and enterprise of the hardy pioneer.
Gold, as a motivating factor in the conquest of the West, was unequaled in its promise of instant wealth. Today, across the West, you can still see the remains of gold towns, now ghostly and deserted, a testament to the scale of settlement inspired by this precious metal. The first and most famous strike was in California in '48. When the gold there was exhausted, the miners spilled back across the West in waves. There was gold found in Arizona, in Colorado, in Idaho, and Montana. As a boy, Black Elk had watched the disruption as miners flooded up the Bozeman Trail to Montana.
Up on the Madison Fork, the Sioux had found much of the yellow metal they worship, and which makes them crazy. And they wanted to have a road up through our country to the place where the yellow metal was. But my people did not want the road. They told us they wanted only to use a little land, as much as a wagon would take between the wheels. But our people knew better. And when you look about you now, you see what it was they wanted.
As yet, the Black Hills of South Dakota remained unexplored, despite the rumors that there was gold here too. For the Lakota Sioux, this was sacred land, and they defended it fiercely. There are stories of prospectors who'd set out for the hills, but none had returned alive. In 1868, the Lakota made a treaty with the Sioux. They gave up their right of free movement on the plains. As compensation, they won a promise that the Black Hills would remain theirs as long as grass should grow and rivers flow. For those like Annie Tallent, who viewed the hills as a source of God-given wealth, the treaty was an obstacle.
It wasn't a treaty we should ever have entered into. Such treaties retard the development of the rich resources of our country. They arrest the advance of civilization.
It was up to the Army to enforce the treaty, to keep the prospectors out. But in 1874, it was the Army that confirmed the rumors of gold on a mapping expedition 600 men strong. In command was a renowned Indian fighter, a man whose provocations against the Lakota would prove his downfall just 2 years later, the infamous General Custer.
He had no right to go in there. All that country was ours. The Sioux had made a treaty with Red Cloud. But Long Hair went to find a yellow metal that makes the Sioux crazy. That was the cause of all the trouble.
If Custer's intent was to find gold in the hills and spark a gold rush here, he was pretty cagey about it. He himself did not play up gold in his official report. He talks about the beauty of the hills and then just mentions almost as an offhand remark that there was some gold found here. However, he brought along 5 newspaper reporters along with the 2 practical miners, so that while he was still in the hills, the Chicago Inter-Ocean and other newspapers around the country were already proclaiming a new El Dorado, new gold strike, riches beyond anyone's belief. So what was being seen in the newspapers was much different than what Custer was reporting officially.
In Sioux City, Iowa, the news provoked a flurry of excitement, and Annie Tallent gathered with a party of prospectors, the Gordon Party, determined to be first into the hills. If they were to succeed, it would take subterfuge. The government had briefed the army to redouble their efforts to keep the miners out. Negotiations had begun to take this land from the Lakota. The presence of miners would only inflame the situation. And so the Gordon Party headed west disguised as settlers, spreading false rumors of their destination. And they took the most dangerous route, through the arid Badlands.
We realized we were on forbidden ground, beyond the pale of the law and cut off from communication with the outside world. But don't you come to the conclusion that we were just freebooters. We weren't freebooters, nor pirates neither. We were peaceable, law-abiding citizens of the United States. We just had a keen eye on the main chance, that's all.
The Gordon Party numbered 30 prospectors. Annie was the only woman among them. They crossed the Badlands without incident, and at last, on December the 21st, 1874, they reached the Black Hills.
As soon as the wagons came to a halt, some of the boys rushed to find the place where Custer's miners said they'd found gold. And they soon came back to camp, waving their hats aloft in such an excited manner we all joined in. Eureka! They found particles of gold in the bottom of each gold pan. And you can be assured there was great rejoicing in our camp that night.
On the site at French Creek stands a replica of the stockade, built by the Gordon Party to defend themselves against the weather and hostile attack.
You can see the massive construction of the cabins, which would have been needed in the winter weather with deep snowfalls. And the upended posts in the ground, dug deep into the ground, would have prevented an immediate onslaught by attackers. As it turned out, the Indians were not their enemy, so to speak, but the U.S. Army was. The Army had heard about them coming into the hills and had sent 3 separate expeditions in to try to find them. And finally, the Army evicted the Gordon Party in April of 1875.
And so, we were back again within the pale of civilization after an absence of nearly 7 months. And thus ended that first expedition. But the way had been opened for the mad rush that followed, and in just 1 year, the Black Hills were transformed. All along the banks of various streams never before trodden by civilized feet, you'd see hundreds of busy prospectors, delving with pan, pick, and shovel. No longer would those hills resound to the war whoop of the Sioux, and the campfires of the red men were extinguished forever.